Hi, this is Irv Shapiro with MakeWithTech. And today, we're going to look at the two most popular slicers, that is to say, the programs you use to prepare models for 3D printing, Ultimaker Cura and Prusa Slicer, the Prusa Slicer. And we're going to look at the current version of these two slicers to point out that in many ways, they have more in common than different. In fact, in looking at these 5 advanced features, we're going to point out features where they share code. That is to say, the underlying programming started from the same set of programming codes from the same code base. So stay tuned and let's learn something together. The MakeWithTech YouTube channel is part of a growing community of services offered by MakeWithTech to the 3D printing and general maker community. There's forum.makewithtech.com where you can talk about things you're doing, things you're making. You can post pictures and files. It's interactive. There are thousands of users there. There's models.makewithtech.com where you can select a template and then put in your own customizing parameters to create a unique model. So if you wanted this particular vase to be wider here, narrower here, a bit shorter, you could select a vase template on MakeWithTech.com and customize it in order to produce a custom model. Now to today's video. Today's video is a more advanced video about slicers. I'm not going to tell you what a slicer is or what it does or how it works. I'm going to look at more advanced features. There are a whole range, a whole bunch of videos on the MakeWithTech channel. I'll link some of them up above that you can watch to learn the basics of 3D printing and how to use slicers. Now, before we dive right in, I need to address is Prusa or Cura better? And the answer is neither. They are very, very close in terms of feature. They don't have identical feature parity. There are things you can do in Cura you can't do in Prusa and vice versa. But ultimately, people select one or other based on usability and which interaction model works best for them. If you look at this slide, you'll see on the left the Prusa Slicer. And the Prusa Slicer uses a series of cascading full pages that allow you to define parameters. If you look on the right, you'll see the Cura Slicer. And the Cura Slicer uses accordion style entry for most parameters and a page that you can pop up to modify which printer you're using. So they look very different. Some people like one, some people like the other. Personally, I use Cura more often because I test a wide range of 3D printers and Cura supports more of those printers. But in particular, if you have a Prusa printer or a Creality printer or some other major brands, there's likely a Prusa Slicer setup and profile for you, and it does an outstanding job. So I'm going to push that debate aside and just look at some key features that they have in common, which are a bit more advanced. Now, in order to understand these advanced features, you often use the help that's built into your slicer. The help in Prusa is better. But there's a wonderful plugin and add-on, and part of the Cura architecture is you go to the item called Marketplace and you can add add-ins. There's a wonderful add-in called the Settings Guide. As you mouse over a parameter, it pops up a lot of information, including often pictures that let you see visually what that parameter is going to do. Now, before we talk about the first feature, I need to make sure everyone understands some basic terminology. I'm sure most of you watching this video already do, but just to be sure, I'm going to review it. If you look at a traditional print, or even if you look at this print, each layer that you're printing really has 3 areas. they have an outer wall, they have infill, and an inner wall. And you'll see that on this particular printer. So the outer wall is orange, the inner walls are purple, and the infill is blue. And you can pick different infill patterns to fill that blue area. Now, in the case of Prusa, they don't call them outer walls, inner walls, and lines. In the case of Cura, there's a bit of overlap between the concept of wall and line. A wall is made up of lines, so a 1.2 millimeter wall with a line width of 0.4 will have 3 lines, 2 inner lines and 1 outer line. You can see that again on this picture. In the case of Prusa, they call them perimeters. But Cura does also have a parameter called flow rate. So line width sets the normative width of a line, multiple lines making up a wall, and flow rate is sort of an adjustment to that. I want to extrude a little more filament or I want to extrude a little less filament. In the case of the Prusa Slicer, the feature for defining the line width or the perimeter width, in effect, is under the Printing Advanced tab, and there are extrusion widths available for a variety of different features. So both Cura and Prusa have a concept of the total size of the wall that's defined by a number of lines called perimeters in Prusa, and then an extrusion width for each of those lines called line width in Cura and extrusion width in Prusa. And then you can fine-tune that by fine-tuning the extrusion multiplier in the case of Prusa or the flow rate in the case of Cura. Now let's look at this diagram together. The diagram on the left edge, on the left side, shows 3 perimeters or 3 lines making up a wall with 3 lines, which a layer height of 1, that's an arbitrary number, it's generally something like 0.4, but I'm just using 1 for illustrative sake. And then you'll see the infill starts. So you'd have 3 lines or 3 perimeters and then the infill. The next diagram in the center, you'll see we have 5 lines and then the infill, but the layer height is the same. The next diagram, you'll see the layer heights are twice as high. So each layer is twice as thick, and then the infill starts, but there are only 3 lines or 3 perimeters. So you can control layers and perimeters or layers and lines, depending on your terminology, in order to control characteristics of the strength and visibly how your model looks. If you have more perimeters or lines, your model will be stronger. In fact, increasing perimeters or lines has been tested by a number of people and generally is a better way to strengthen a model than using a denser infill. In addition, if you use thicker layers, your model will generally be stronger. But with thicker layers, the model layers will be more visible. And the reason we'll see in just a moment. Here is a diagram. Here's a picture that I took right off the Prusa online help. And you'll see that the layer height of 0.3 is much more visible than the layer height of 0.1, but that the model printed at a larger layer height, a bigger layer height, was a much faster print. Now, something we have to think about is when you increase a layer height, you're not increasing a rectangle. Layers don't get laid down as rectangles. They get laid down as ovals. So let's look at this diagram. And you'll see as you increase the layer height, the gaps around those ovals, the empty spaces get bigger also. That's why they're more visible, because they're ovals. If they were rectangles, if there was a way to extrude rectangles and not ovals, then larger layers would not be more visible. So when you increase the layer height of your model, you're increasing how it looks, and you're also increasing the spacing specifications. So all of a sudden, the same model printed at a larger layer height is going to be slightly wider because of those increases in layer heights. Now, the first feature we're going to talk about is variable layer heights. Both Prusa and Cura support them. The Prusa implementation is much more sophisticated, but I found the UI relatively difficult to use. So if we look at this diagram together, we'll see on the left, under experimental, you can check use adaptive layers. Now in the case of Prusa, you'll see here on the screen where you enable it. And in both cases, a great way to find these parameters is use the search capability, which is available in both user interfaces. But once you enable it, when you're viewing your model on the main model page, not the previewed layer page, you can actually take and vary the height of layers manually. Very powerful feature in Prusa, not available in Cura. The user interface is a little messy to deal with, but it is an advantage in this case of Prusa. But both slicers have variable layer heights. Number 2, let's talk about vase mode. Now, if you're an advanced 3D print user, you've probably printed things in vase mode. Vase mode is very interesting because it does two things. First of all, it prints a single wall. That means your vases are going to be very weak. This was not printed in vase mode. This was printed in traditional mode, so I could control the width of this wall. The wall could be made of multiple lines. In vase mode, you have one line. You have a bottom, you have no top. But you also have a continuous stream of filament. In traditional printing, you print a layer, then you move up, you print another layer, you move up, you print another layer. And every time you move up, you might leave a little bit of extra filament, an artifact, and that's going to create a seam. In vase modes, you have no seams. Your prints are absolutely perfect because it's literally making a micro adjustment to the height every time it continues to move that spiral print pattern. That's why it's called Spiralize in Cura. So in Cura, it's called Spiralize. In Prusa, it's called vase mode. Now, in addition, because you're not filling in the infill, your prints, and you're printing just a single wall, your prints are going to be much, much faster. Both slicers have a Spiralize or a vase mode, and they work very similar. Now, when you select the mode in Prusa Slicer, they do a very nice thing, and they tell you all of the other parameters they're going to impact, and you can see that here on the screen. Net, both slicers have a vase mode. They both work well. We talked about variable layer heights. What about variable line width? Well, until recently, there was very limited support for variable line width in either of these slicers. The Arachne engine is a set of algorithms for varying the line width as it prints. So basically telling the printer to extrude a little more or a little less filament as it goes around that layer. So let's look at this picture together. The top diagram, these two diagrams come right from the Cura release page on the Arachne engine or variable line width. You'll see a feature that's printed with the traditional Cura engine. And what you're trying to do is print a wall that's a particular width where the multiple of the lines is not the multiple of line width. So if you have a line width, a nozzle of 0.4, let's say you have a line width of 0.4, that means you can print a wall for a model that's 0.4, 0.8, 1.2. But if you want to print 1.5, it's not going to come out even. So what do? You leave some gaps between the outer walls and the inner walls, and you fill them in with infill. So you can see an example of that on the top left diagram. On the bottom left diagram, you'll see what happens when you're using the new Arachne variable line width capability in Cura. It's actually going to make the individual lines or walls thinner or thicker to minimize those infills. That's going to make your print stronger. It's going to make your prints print faster. And this ability to print variable line widths also allows Cura with the Arachne engine to print more detailed or finer details. Well, guess what? In 2.5 of Prusa Slicer that was released recently, right in the release video, they give credit to Cura and say we thank Cura for making their source code open source where everyone can see it because we've used it to make Prusa better. So you basically have a very similar implementation of the Arachne engine in both Cura and Prusa. In this case, the feature was in Cura first and then in Prusa. In other cases, that might not be the case. We'll look at one in a few moments. Now, like every upgrade, if we look at the slide, not everything is coming up roses. So if you're printing variable widths, you have to change the extrusion, how much filament you're pushing out, a lot. That works great with a direct extruder. It works a little less well with a Bowden style extruder. This is going to push the print industry towards direct extruders, in my opinion, because this new feature just works a bit better with direct extruders. Now, this next feature is all about making top and bottom surfaces cleaner, look smoother, almost like they were injection molded. Now, if you say something solid like this, it's really easy. The slicer can just print lines going back and forth, one next to each other, and it's going to look beautiful. But if you take a model that has some detail in it, so this actually has MakeWithTech, MWT in it. When the slicer comes to that opening, it might print this side, then it's going to print this side. In the middle, it might stop, it might start. It's going to optimize the print speed. And in optimizing the print speed, it's going to create a surface that doesn't look perfectly uniform. So what are monotonic top layers? If you look at this picture here, you'll see on the right a print with monotonic top layers on the left with it off. And what it says is always print in one direction. So keep printing in the same direction over and over again. So that way the surface is most likely to be perfectly smooth. This feature was introduced in Prusa first and then copied by Cura. Next feature is very interesting. If you look at a model like this, you don't really care how strong it is. It could be weaker like a vase mode model. But you really can't print it in vase mode because all of these details wouldn't work. There's a top here. You can't say don't print a top, and the top is all over the place in essence. So you need to print some infill inside in order to support the top. Let's look at this diagram to get a better idea of what that means. On the top right, you'll see an example of a bridge. A bridge is where you have two vertical printed features and a feature spanning them. And 3D printers can span gaps of a particular size. It depends on the printer. It could be 1 millimeter, 10 millimeters, 30 millimeters, but 3D printers can span a gap. And the filament won't droop too much if the gap is within a certain tolerance. So if a top layer is wider than that gap, you need something to support it underneath. So if you look at the diagram on the bottom right, you'll see that when the gap is on the outside of a model, you tell the model to add supports. But many of us don't think about the fact that infill is a type of support. And very often you add infill just for support, not because you want to make it stronger. So if you were to add a tree-style infill, and that's called lightning infill, and it was introduced first in Cura, open source, and then copied with an acknowledgement from Prusa into version 2.5 of Prusa. So lightning infill is when you don't care about your model being extra strong, you just want it to not collapse. So it uses the minimal amount of infill in a tree-like structure to support all of the features. Well, folks, we covered 5 very interesting features: adaptive layers, Spiralize or vase mode, the Arachne variable line width feature, monotonic top layers, and lightning. All advanced features, all available both in Cura and Prusa. So which slicer should you use? Whichever one just fits your eye best, because they both produce excellent prints. That's not to say on a particular print with a particular set of circumstances, you won't get better results in Prusa than Cura. So if you're doing this professionally, you want the finest features, you might want to try printing the same print with both slicers and just see which one gives you better quality. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give me a thumbs up, suggest the video to other people, click on the bell so you're notified about more videos. Head over to models.makewithtech.com and check out the new template-based model generator. Have a great day, and let's continue to learn together.